Let's talk about getting an army together for the boys in blue, with some thoughts as to how to start an Ultramarines army in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of collecting Ultramarines in the current edition of the game. In the video we'll talk about why you might want to collect an Ultramarines army in the first place, a few ideas about planning out a force, then some ideas for first miniatures to buy, and various Space Marine discount options out there. I looked through the characters' datasheets in game and their iconic Gladius task force, and just one example army list. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up though, why might you want to collect Ultramarines in the first place? The Ultramarines are basically the archetypical Space Marines, the poster boys of Warhammer 40k. It's them that's on all the box art with their iconic blue armour, and perhaps not too surprising given that they're really quite prominent both in art and in lore, that loads of people come into contact with them really quite early when they're collecting Warhammer 40k, and just see them as the epitome of what a Space Marine should be. Originally they were the 13th Legion of Space Marines, and generally tending to be one of the most overachieving. They're best known for their tactical acumen and their efficient and flexible battle plans, bringing the enormous and destructive tools that the Adeptus Astartes have to offer in a perfect concert to deliver victory for the Emperor and move on to take down the next threat to humanity. During the Horus Heresy, the Ultramarines survived relatively unscathed, the rebellion of the War Master occurring when the Ultramarines were far away from the Holy Throne of Terror, perhaps deliberately so, and therefore they survived the Horus Heresy with a huge amount of fighting strength intact and founded a great number of chapters, Rabute Gilliman setting out the framework for how Space Marines would operate in the future galaxy, the Codex Astartes being the great guiding tome that tries to distill Gilliman's tactical genius as a guiding light for many other chapters out there. Since then, the Ultramarines have occupied their semi-independent area of space called Ultramar, not seeking tithe or support from the rest of the Imperium and defending it themselves. They've weathered multiple big invasions such as the Tyranids of High Fleet Behemoth and the Death Guard in the Plague Wars, and now Rabute Gilliman has returned himself, though has to command not just his chapter but the entire Imperium, commanding the Imperium's forces against a galaxy of horrors. Styling-wise, they're sort of vaguely Romanesque themed, lots of sort of faux Latin sounding names, and they tend to favour a balanced approach to war, meaning that they might fight with a good mix of infantry armoured vehicles and to lead close combat troops, though perhaps the most iconic unit might be the standard Space Marine with a bolter, maybe a tactical marine or intercessor. I feel like sometimes people criticise Ultramarines as me as maybe a bit protagonist or Mary Sue. Certainly in the past we have had Space Marine codexes that feature them maybe to too much exclusion of the other chapters. I feel like when you get under the surface they still have some really interesting lore there, and why a whole load of people stick with them even after initially being drawn in. Otherwise, for miniatures, the Ultramarines have access to the Great Big Space Marine range, the biggest and most frequently updated army in Warhammer 40k. They've got good excuse to use basically all of it, as you'll see just about every bit of box art has Ultramarines on it, and they do have a few unique things of their own, an upgrade sprue for some shoulder pads and things like that, plus a small range of characters including Rabute Gilliman himself, but maybe not quite as many unique things as say like the Dark Angels or Blood Angels. You can also dig into their Resin Horus Heresy range if desired as well. There's a few more themed characters, units, and upgrades there too. For tactically balanced Ultramarines, as mentioned, things like standard intercessors with bolt rifles, or maybe mixed specialists such as aggressors might be kind of appropriate, a bit of range, a bit of melee, and giving you the option to command things very differently. Otherwise, for their unique miniatures, here we've got Chief Librarian Varro Targerius. His legendary foresight has often been a source of wisdom for the chapter. Marius Calgar, the chapter master, is fielded alongside his Victrix Honor Guards, really quite cool Space Marines with some awesome shields in my opinion. Calgar fights with the enormous power fist, the gauntlets of Ultramar, as well respected for his combat prowess as well as his fairly godly command abilities. The Ultramarines are one of the few loyalists with their Primarch. Rabute Gilliman holds the Emperor's sword and fights in his very fancy and embossed armour of fate. In terms of spending money to get points on the board, Primarchs tend to be really quite good for the loyalists, the Lion and Rabute Gilliman being better than most kits on that front. And otherwise here is this Primaris upgrade sprue, some sculpted shoulder pads if you don't want to do transfers or freehand or anything like that, plus a few other bits including a small Gladius sword and an Auspex. I will admit I'm not sure it's one of the most exciting Space Marine upgrade sprues out there. Finally, for things in resin, here on the left you can see an example from the Horus Heresy range. If you wanted a Terminator captain, then this Legion Praetor could be kind of fun. It's got a good amount of sculpted ultramarine detail there, and it's a bit more themed than some of the more generic captains. And to notice that they still sell the Ultramarines Honor Guard. They're a unit that used to have a more active datasheet in the past, now they're considered a Legends unit. If you wanted to field them, I think you could still reasonably proxy them as things, maybe run them as Blade Guard veterans or similar. The stand-ins won't be quite right, but there are some pretty fun themed old school miniatures. For Space Marines in general, pricing tends to be a fair bit cheaper than for most of Warhammer 40k. Space Marines get tons of access to discount deals and are usually fairly elite, which usually helps on that front. Maybe the Ultramarines might be a tiny bit better than average for Space Marines in terms of getting points on the table, given that they've got access to Calgar and Rabute Gilliman, both of which are alright for their points for the money. Finally, in terms of gameplay, like the rest of the Codex chapters, Ultramarines use the rules from Codex Space Marines. Classically, they might be perhaps a little bit more range focused versus melee, at least compared with some chapters out there, but they absolutely use good numbers of both. I feel like if you use the Gladius task force as their more themed force, it maybe does push you in that kind of way. Tactical and Devastator Doctrine are both really big boosts for ranged armies, allowing you to move fast or fall back and shoot. Assault Doctrine is genuinely a massive boost to melee squads, and it does mean that having some of each is great. Otherwise, Ultramarines are known to do very well with the Vanguard Spearhead. The stealthy formation makes some good use of combos for their characters, as we'll get onto. But you can use any of the core detachments from Codex Space Marines, they don't lock you out by paint scheme anymore. Currently, in terms of gameplay power, core Codex Space Marines is seen as a bit underpowered versus the rest, though I'm sure that will change with time. Out of the options within the core codex, both the Gladius Task Force and Ultramarines Vanguard are generally seen as fairly strong relative to the rest, at least compared with a few of the other chapters' unique stuff. They're certainly pretty playable as Space Marines go. Overall, if you want a tactically balanced army of Space Marines striving to apply every facet of the Codex Astartes and their ways of war into battle, and some nice blue heraldry and Romanesque styling is for you, then maybe you might like to collect Ultramarines. Moving on, let's talk about planning an army. I think it usually might make some good sense to plan out a 1000 point or 2000 point army list when you're getting going, maybe using Battlescribe, New Recruit, or Warhammer's app. Space Marines are an army with an absolutely enormous range, so you certainly can either go for just a good collection of what you find interesting and effective, or try and go for some sort of big theme. The majority of Space Marine players tend to build up a bit of a force of somewhat balanced options within the army. They certainly could go down certain routes out of the force, maybe Dreadnought heavy lists, or focus almost exclusively on either range or melee. As mentioned, the Ultramarines are perhaps more likely than most to have a mix though, and if you're collecting for certain detachments like the Gladius Task Force, that's also probably going to be encouraged as well. Some big scary shooting units to make use of combos like the Fire Discipline one, plus some good assault units that can move surprisingly fast with Assault Doctrine. As mentioned, more iconic units for the chapter might be things like Intercessors and Tactical Marines, and maybe Elite Infantry a bit more so than vehicles perhaps. Things like Stern Guard, Blade Guard, Terminators, or Aggressors. They feel like the absolute paragons of Space Marines fighting on foot perhaps, and might be pretty prominent in a themed army, being led into battle by their character choices. You could just absolutely collect a force more for gameplay and make use of the things that are most effective in Codex Space Marines right now. Again, that feels kind of Ultramarine in its own way. Things like some sturdy objective holders to take points, some primary damage dealers, and maybe some mission units to jump around doing secondary objectives. Otherwise, you could decide which of the named characters you want to use out of the Ultramarines army, if any. Are you going to collect one given company, or are you going to have the whole roster of the Ultramarines High Command available? The other thing to do when planning an army would be to paint up a test model. As a first port of call, I'd likely go for something fairly standard in power armor, maybe an Intercessor or an Assault Intercessor, perhaps an Infernus Marine, given that they're fairly easy to get hold of now, with coming in the starter sets and things. There's plenty of good painting guides online and here on YouTube. The Ultramarines are definitely very well represented by all sorts of creators making their own takes as to how to execute that iconic blue. If you did just want to go absolutely super easy, then Games Workshop literally have a contrast paint called Ultramarines Blue, which could definitely get you really quite a long way to an effective army very quickly, if you just wanted to get lots of power armor on the table nice and quick. Another thing to think about might be how you're going to put chapter logos on the army if you want to. There's a few different options. You can use transfers, you can get the upgrade sprues for the moulded details, though if you go very heavy into those, it will add a fair bit of significant expense. And in this day and age, I'd certainly bear in mind that plenty of 3D printing creators have also made some suitable chapter logos that could be stuck directly onto shoulder pads, and you might find that a more economical option. Talking of actually getting miniatures on the table though, let's talk about a few first purchases. As with standard Space Marines, I'd likely start with one of the Space Marine discount sets. Space Marines do have an awful lot of options to choose from, maybe either the starter sets, which would be the best way to get your hands on Combat Patrol Space Marines, the Leviathan box if you still have access to it, or perhaps one of the combat patrols. A lot of the more divergent chapter specific ones seem to work oddly well for Ultramarines. Otherwise, if you're looking for something a bit less spendy, I'd likely start with some sort of basic unit, maybe some intercessors to work out paint schemes on them, or anything else that you find particularly iconic or inspiring. Getting into discount sets, Combat Patrol Space Marines might be one thing that you look at quite a bit. It feels nice enough for Ultramarines. It's certainly kind of cool to see the chapter in action against the Tyranids of Leviathan in the 10th edition launch trailer, even if things very much aren't going all their way there. In this one you get 5 Terminators, 5 Infernus Marines, a Terminator Librarian and Captain, so around 435 points of Marines on the board. As I mentioned in just about every Space Marine video though, don't get it via the actual Combat Patrol set from Games Workshop's web store. The actual way to get the Combat Patrol Space Marines if you want them is to pick up the 40k starter set and then get the Terminator Librarian separately. That will be directly cheaper, plus also wind you up with a whole load of Tyranid miniatures as well that you could either split with a friend, resell them, or just paint up as a painting project if you wanted. The other option is to get the Ultimate Starter Set. That one also adds in some terrain, includes the Terminator Librarian and a small core rules book. It is significantly more at £125 or $210. So for me the choice would be whether or not the standard starter set plus the Terminator Librarian for like around about £90 makes sense more than upgrading for the extra £35 for the extra bits like the terrain and the rulebook and the extra Tyranids. I imagine quite a lot of people who want the Leviathan set have already got one by now, but it is absolutely worth mentioning as perhaps the single best Space Marine deal that Games Workshop's ever done, at least in terms of percentage discount versus how they normally sell things. This one gets the Combat Patrol plus Stern Guard, a Ballistas Dreadnought and some extra characters, and another squad of Infernus Marines as well, plus the core rulebook and the Leviathan mission deck. This one's long gone from the Games Workshop web store, but you do still see them around in Warhammer brick and mortar stores from time to time, and a few particularly well stocked retailers still have some. Element Games, links down in the video description in the UK, still has a whole bunch of them left for £150. If you can find a Tyranid collector to split this one 50-50 with, it's by far the cheapest way to get points of nice new Space Marine sculpts on the board at the moment. Otherwise for discount options there's the Combat Patrol boxes. I certainly wouldn't discount the more chapter specific ones. The Blood Angels one in particular I think is a really nice little balanced box of various different generic Space Marines to start with. If you're doing Ultramarines you wouldn't use the Blood Angels upgrade sprues, but it remains really quite a good deal on these Space Marines compared with separate price, even if you didn't use those sprues or just threw away or resold them or something. This one gets you a Librarian, some Aggressors, Infiltrators or Incursors, and some Intercessors. Overall feels quite well rounded to me, most of them are at least fairly usable in game. Otherwise, if wanting some more elite infantry and some more intercessor troops, there's the Dark Angels Combat Patrol. At present this one actually works kind of surprisingly well with the Blood Angels one. I feel like the two have quite a lot of synergy. The Gravis Captain in this one could lead the aggressors from the Blood Angels Combat Patrol, and perhaps the Hellblasters could jump in the Impulsor for a ride to be a battlefield taxi, zooming around and firing out plasma shots. This one gets you around about 460 points worth of Space Marines on the board. I feel like it's not awful as a starter option, maybe a little bit intercessor heavy. The discount is a touch lower than some of the combat patrols, but still a handy enough 20% or so off. Again, like the Blood Angels, it's not very Dark Angels, but that doesn't really matter if you're collecting Ultramarines. Otherwise, for a different take, there's Combat Patrol Space Wolves. That one's a bit more Phobos themed, 10 intercessors once more, then an Invicta Warsuit, 5 Reavers, and a themed Space Wolves battle leader. I feel like the biggest decision is whether or not you'd want the Invicta Warsuit, and I must admit maybe having the more themed Space Wolf things on the battle leader does lessen its value a bit. Finally, perhaps for slightly more notable discount deals is the Vanguard Task Force. This one's a Games Workshop web store direct one, so not available at most discount retailers. Though certain places like Wargame Portal, linked in the video description, might be able to help you in the USA. This one's a little bit less than the Combat Patrol box sets and gets you a force focused around Phobos Marines. Might be better as a bit more of an expansion for a force rather than the absolute core of one perhaps. The miniatures are monopose, but I think in general it still gives you a pretty good amount of relatively recent Primaris sculpts for your money. Talking of buying things and discount retailers, I'd certainly be aware of your options when buying Warhammer models. Direct from Games Workshop and the Warhammer web store is generally the most reliable but also one of the most expensive. If you're looking for most of the standard Combat Patrols, starter sets or individual units, I'd usually tend to go via either local or online gaming stores. The official third-party sellers that Games Workshop allows them to sell their own miniatures at a discount usually allowing you to save around about 10 to 20% depending on where you are in the world and which one you go with. I do have just a few examples of those links down in the video description. Element Games in the UK does 15% off, Gap Games in Australia does 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada has 10% off plus their loyalty scheme, and Wargame Portal in the USA does a big 15% off. As mentioned, can also be one to go for certain direct-only items like that Vanguard Task Force. There are plenty of others, though these ones are linked in the video description. It will help support the channel if you bought anything through them. A big thank you to any of you choosing to use those when you do pick up minis. Discount retailers like that will be my go-to if I were getting purely new plastic kits, though there's still other options beyond that. The second-hand market, such as eBay and other people reselling locally, can often be worth a look. As always, their quality could be very variable, but depending on what you can find, you could potentially save really quite a lot of money and potentially a fair bit of time and effort as well. Getting a few eBay rescues to help bulk out an army definitely isn't the worst idea in the world. Otherwise, in this day and age, 3D printing and third-party manufacturers also exist as well. There's lots of alternative sculpts out there for generic guys in power armor that could proxy in as Space Marines, and it can be really quite a handy choice for getting certain parts and weapons and aesthetic upgrades as well, as mentioned things like shoulder icons or other things that might fit the sort of Romanesque power armored styling. Next up, for other more interesting models, let's talk through the roster of Ultramarines characters. Uriel Ventris is the captain of the Space Marine 4th Company, really quite a nicely done miniature in my opinion. 75 points in game and a 5 wound captain with a nice bit of melee and a boosted bolt gun. His big thing at the moment is that he can grant deep strike to one unit in your roster, and it doesn't even have to be the one that he's leading. It means that you could potentially have some Melter Eradicators pop up at close range if it made sense to you, or perhaps very notably have that given to Centurions in the Vanguard Spearhead formation. If you give them deep strike, then if you put them into strategic reserve with a stratagem, you could potentially have them warp around the board, always getting line of sight. Some very spooky firepower indeed there. Chief Librarian Tigurius, I feel like is really quite an easy to use and well-rounded option. 75 points for a Librarian that gets you -1 to hit. Free Overwatch for his unit, a surprisingly dangerous bit of psychic firepower with the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath, a bit of melee as well, and even a bit of defense against psychic and mortal wounds. I can't help but think that he'd probably quite like to lead Hellblasters, which unfortunately aren't an option for him. I feel like he can be genuinely very good value in things like Stern Guard and Intercessor squads though, if you fancied. I think it's quite cheap for this cluster of abilities at just 75 points. Cato Sicarius is the oldest of the Ultramarines characters, his miniature being an older resin one, so it doesn't quite hold up to the Primaris style scaling. I would also say that his rules are perhaps the most niche at the moment as well. He gives his unit Scout, Assault Weapons, and a once per turn reactive move, definitely all kind of helpful things, but I'd argue maybe just feel like very slightly peripheral advantages. Feels like he could definitely be a nuisance when skirmishing over the midfield objectives with some sort of squad of elites, though most people choose to leave him on the shelf at the moment, unfortunately. The same can't be said for Marnius Calgar though, 185 points for the Ultramarines Chapter Master, and coming with those two Victrix Honor Guards as mentioned, I'd say that he is absolutely worth the points. Pretty massive melee stats, and certainly when you include all of the relic power swords that his guards get as well. He generates you a command point a turn, which has got a lot of value just in itself, and basically gets all of the combat doctrines active all the time, advance and shoot, advance and charge, and fallback shoot and charge as well. He's usually seen leading a big squad of Blade Guard or Aggressors, maybe deployed out of a Land Raider, or maybe using the slightly crazy combo of infiltrating him with the Ultramarines Vanguard Spearhead. If you put him in a big squad of Aggressors and attach an Apothecary Biologist, you can give that Apothecary the enhancements to infiltrate up the board and deploy this guy in the midfield for something really terrifying there. Finally, we have the Primarch himself. Rabute Gilliman is 360 points, a big chunky stat line, and you can't shoot him directly if he's next to some other friendly infantry. Massive melee stats as you'd expect, and he gets to choose either marking 2 units for Oath of Moment or handing out some free stratagems to models nearby. Lots of interesting ways to use him, including Ironstorm Spearhead for extra copies of their nice battle tactics, or potentially doing gamey things by keeping him hidden with Lone Operative by pairing him with a combi weapon lieutenant. He also gets up on a 3+ when he dies the first time, which is kind of disruptive. In general, he is a bit overcosted in game at the moment, though I feel like lots of Ultramarine players are just happy to get their Primarch regardless. As mentioned earlier, just in terms of getting points on the board for not that much money investment, he's one of the very best options here. His model is only $70, so you're around about the 5 points per dollar sort of mark, which is far above the vast majority of 40K's offerings. Otherwise, for their unique miniatures, as mentioned, they've got the upgrade sprues, two different options on sale from Games Workshop at the moment, this Firstborn stylistic one on the left, or the more new Primaris one on the right. Both of them have a few fun parts for Ultramarines theming and those sculpted shoulder pads. As mentioned though, if you did want to go heavy into these, it's going to cost you a fairly significant amount of money versus just using transfers or similar to that, as a lot of people tend to do. Finally, for model kits that I just wanted to call more special attention to, I really think that for collecting Space Marines, Hellblasters are well worth a mention in 10th edition. I really would rate this as a good unit to get hold of for newer players in 10th edition early. Even though they went down in points very slightly at the last update, they still get you a lot of points on the board for how much they cost. A points per dollar ratio of around about 4-ish, which is far better than the vast majority of other kits out there. If you just want points of Space Marines on the board to get you towards any given point size game, these guys do better than the combat patrols. As well as that, for newer players, they're just generally very easy to use, fairly general purpose damage, and they get to fire in death as well, which means that even if you do mess up with them, you still get a bit of a consolation prize. And between those two reasons, they are generally seen as one of the units that opponents really don't want to see on the other side of the board. Near guarantees enough to cause at least some problems if played with carefully. Of course, Space Marines with exciting plasma guns are just kind of fun as well, and the all around just tend to be a pretty popular purchase due to that. Between all that, I'd usually look to get a bit of a core of the force on the go with maybe one or two different discount sets, plus adding in some of the Ultramarines specific characters that you like. For expanding an army beyond the core, there's always a whole ton of scope for just collecting what you like the look of. Warhammer 40k rules tend to change over time, and to some extent, chasing the exact top meta units can be a bit of a fool's errand for Space Marines. They've got such an enormous range that the optimal list for a Space Marine army could just be vastly different from one codex to the next. Perhaps one of the most obvious things to focus on doing it early though is to get at least some scary damage dealers in the army. With all the discount sets, they tend to give you maybe a slight overabundance of things with bolters or things that are good against lighter infantry. I feel like I've seen a fair few newer players with Space Marines that just have loads of bolter shots in the army and just can't handle enemy heavy armor when it's there. So you want to look at some of the units that have more efficient big guns or hefty melee, say mass damage too, like those Hellblasters. Perhaps some Eradicators with some scary melter, or big nasty general purpose threats like the Redemptor, or even maybe the Brutalis Dreadnought. Certainly for expanding an army from the core, I look at things that are really going to be your mainstay damage dealers to be first sort of purchases. Probably slightly more so than some other more subtle things. Otherwise though, just for a few examples of some currently slightly stronger units, Infiltrators and Scouts are really quite nice for the objective game. Infiltrators to deny enemy reserves and make your home objectives nice and safe. Scouts are almost never a bad idea to have a unit or two start in the midfield and start scrapping over those midfield objectives early, maybe threatening to do some secondaries. Otherwise, for big damage dealer things, the Ballistus, Redemptor, and Brutalis Dreadnoughts are all pretty usable. Things like the Gladiator Lancers and Repulsor Executioners are nice and scary. The Land Raider Redeemer is a particularly popular transport for delivering elite melee combos into battle. And lots of the elite infantry is usable enough. Hellblasters, Eradicators, Blade Guard, maybe even Terminators now they went down in points a bit. For the most part, after several balance passes, I feel like the Space Marine army isn't too bad, the majority of the stuff at least playable, even if currently the core codex maybe isn't particularly standout strong. Overall, with some combination of discount kits, stronger units, and just anything that you find particularly cool or you'd like to have in your army, I build towards a 2,000 point army list. I have a very rough idea as to where you're going, but absolutely to keep adapting and getting games in and learn a bit more about the army as you go along. Finally, we have touched on the special characters, but let's talk rules for the army. As mentioned, the Gladius task force is pretty much the themed attachment for the Ultramarines, so I'm going to mainly focus on that for today. At the end though, I thought I'd talk about one Vanguard Spearhead army list as well, and why that works well for the boys in blue. Gladius task force is aimed to give you a bit of the rapid battle plans and formations that the Ultramarines can put down, and the core rule is kind of fun and movement based: advance and shoot in Devastator Doctrine, fall back, shoot and charge in the turn that you select Tactical Doctrine, and advance and shoot in the Assault Doctrine. All three of those are powerful, maybe the Devastator and Assault Doctrine being the most obvious, though Tactical is usually likely to come up in more games than not, particularly if you're fighting against a foe with plenty of melee. Between those three, I think it already does make sense to have at least some range in melee. It's usually a good idea in Warhammer 40k, but particularly given the existence of the Assault Doctrine, it means that you get one turn where melee units just have a very scary threat range. At least having one or two countercharge units to really make great use of that is generally going to be good. Stratagems wise, there's Armour of Contempt, the old reliable one to help out with your armour saves. Honor the Chapter is a really good melee damage dealer, Lance keyword for +1 to wound in melee, and extra AP if you happen to be an Assault Doctrine, great for things like Blade Guard. Squad Tactics allow infantry or mounted units to move d6 inches if the enemy finishes a move within 9, and that can be absolutely huge sometimes. Could lead you to backpedaling from a charge that you can then avoid, or unexpectedly hide a really important unit from enemy firepower, and if you're in Tactical Doctrine you get 6 inches as well, so absolute reliability on how far you can fall back. Storm of Fire is the battle tactic that allows you to ignore cover when shooting, and also gain AP in the Devastator Doctrine, really powerful to use in that one where you can make the difference of basically AP -2 versus an enemy's save, and it's part of the big fire discipline combo as we'll get onto. Only in Death is maybe one of the more niche, you can use it to basically guarantee that your Space Marines still get to fight in combat, though at 2 CP it is pretty pricey. And finally, one of the most reliable and usable is Adaptive Strategy, 1 command points to flex out a combat doctrine for something else. Excellent if the majority of your army wants to be in Devastator for example, but you've just got that one unit that needs the advance and charge. In general, I'd say that it's really a good set of stratagems, lots of very usable ones that can make some big swings in the game, and a couple of perhaps surprisingly vicious damage boosts. Otherwise, for enhancements, the Honor Vehement is a melee boost, alright if you've got some spare points. Artificer Armor gives you a 2+ save and a 5+ feel no pain, again alright for spare points, and usually best on a character that is either super fragile or you think is going to be on the front lines. The real money feels like it's in Fire Discipline though. 30 points to give your unit sustained hits 1 at range for the bearer's led unit, plus a 5+ critical hit in Devastator Doctrine. At 30 points, even with that, it's kind of auto-include if you've got a relevant unit to boost, but then if you combo it with a Lieutenant or an Apothecary Biologist, it gets very silly. Finally, Adept of the Codex is 20 points, and that's Captain only. That means the bearer's unit can always flex into the Tactical Doctrine. Definitely not unhelpful if the bearer's unit's on the front line, maybe just a little bit borderline and situational for 20 points committed pre-game though. As mentioned, the one that I really focus on for the enhancements is the Fire Discipline one, the basic idea being that this can get you critical hits on a 5+, that means you get a whole load of sustained hits when you're in Devastator Doctrine, and you can use that 1 command point stratagem to flex into Devastator Doctrine if you're not in it. Then you give an enhancements to either an Apothecary Biologist or a Lieutenant, then literally every single 5 and 6 that you roll will be both a sustained hit and a lethal hit, so 1 auto wound and 1 extra hit that you then have to roll to wound with, but overall it's just a ton of firepower, and then you can combo all that with Oath of Moment, and then you just simply reroll everything that isn't a 5 or 6, because those are such ludicrous value that it's usually worth even re-rolling successful hits. Classically, it's often been aggressors with Boltstorm Gauntlets that tend to be people's first choice for that, maybe jumping out of a Land Raider, and then the Boltstorm and Fragstorm gets to the point where it can genuinely threaten to pop heavy battle tanks in a single turn, which is kind of mad. Though I feel like given the latest points changes, it's looking very nice on Hellblasters for 230 points per that unit. I've certainly seen plenty of people run it on that, just massive firepower on an already general purpose and dangerous unit, hard to go too far wrong. Just for a very rough idea as to the aggressor numbers though, if you had 6 Boltstorm aggressors with the Fragstorm grenades, plus an Apothecary Biologist leading them with this enhancement, and then you combine Devastator Doctrine and Storm of Fire and Oath of Moment all on their luckless targets, that gets you around about 40 shots, mostly at strength 4, AP 2 and damage 1 ignoring cover on the closest target, with lots of reroll sustained hits and twin linked things as mentioned. Should be an overall unit that can power through around about 40+ Horde models with Blast, around about 10 or more standard Space Marines, about 6 Terminators, and fairly easily handle the vast majority of big heavy battle tanks even. Pretty crazy damage in the shooting phase there, particularly as you can then go on to charge and get those power fists to good work. It does have its downsides though, the aggressors do need to try and be targeting their closest target, and you do need to deliver them into range. As mentioned, a Land Raider could be kind of interesting for that, or maybe Uriel Ventress to teleport them around the board. Again, I feel like we'll be seeing similar numbers with people using Hellblasters with the combo. The drop from 125 points down to 115 was enough to get them from sort of mid to sort of great, I think. Finally, as mentioned, Gladius isn't the only way that you can run Ultramarines. They do have a lot of good success with the rather sneaky sort of Raven Guard themed Vanguard Spearhead. This one's an old tournament list from a little while back, run by James Shapiro to win a GT. Since the points changes after this has happened, the list is a good amount over 2,000 points now. I'd say it's more for just the general theme to see what's going on with this one. You could just drop 1 unit of Inceptors and I believe that evens out the points, or just embrace some slightly different units that hadn't had increases since this. The general idea is that you've got some nice objective holding units, scouts to take the midfield, and infiltrators to deny deep strike on the home objective. Then Marnie's Calgar and that Apothecary Biologist can both join the big aggressor unit, infiltrate them into the midboard with Blade Driven Deep as the enhancement, and there you've got a hilariously scary 10 model unit with enormous shooting and melee damage, and Marnie's Calgar's guards to be able to tank high AP things on their 4+ invulnerables. Then Uriel Ventress is around as well. He's leading some company heroes here just for a durable skirmish unit for the midfield, but he gives his deep strike to some Devastator Centurions with las cannons and missile launchers. That means that they can get the Alpha Strike with a deep strike if they need to, and then after that they've got a stratagem to be able to return to reserves at the end of the enemy turn, so you could have them essentially warp off the board and then deep strike them somewhere else each turn if you kept on feeding them CP. Just a massively scary threat with those dangerous las cannons and missile launchers. Beyond that, there's a Stormspeeder Hammer Strike to deny some cover, some units of Inceptors for close range drops, and again they can make some pretty good use of the taking on and off the board, and some Eradicators for some dedicated anti-tank. There's also a Calidus Assassin able to bounce around and do some secondary objectives while all this is going on as well. Overall does look quite a good example of Ultramarines Vanguard Spearhead, just literally drop one unit of Inceptors and it's still good to go at the moment and will give a lot of armies a bit of trouble to handle. In any case though, hopefully that's given you a few ideas as to collecting Ultramarines, both in terms of why you might want to collect, planning an army, and getting miniatures on the board, and a few fun thoughts on gameplay. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas down in the comments below. As per always, what's your experience of collecting the boys in blue? If you'd like something else to check out for Space Marine related stuff, I'll leave a link to my Strengths and Weaknesses of Space Marine Units video down in the video description. Feel free to give that a look next. In any case, a big thank you for listening. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to keep 40k videos coming most days. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.